you 7 tips to help make your characters into real flesh and blood humans, and I would bet that you probably haven't heard most of them. Let's get started right away with number 1. Give your characters different scripts. So at the Actors Studio in New York City, there was a director who took a character playing a principal and took a character playing a mother, and a son had been expelled from school. But he told them completely different things about the scene. He told the principal, listen, this boy was a terror in class, he never listened to his teachers. And he told the mother, oh, your son was very well behaved and the principal is prejudiced against him. Well, because those characters had completely different scripts, they erupted into this crazy conflict in the scene. You want to give your characters different scripts as well. And a great example of how to do this comes from The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald.
You just said F. Scott Fitzgerald. What did Scott Fitzgerald do to you?
How does Nick Carraway, the narrator, see Jay Gatsby? Well, he sees him as a hopeful dreamer with a genuinely good heart. On the other hand, how does Tom Buchanan, Daisy's husband, view Jay Gatsby? Well, I mean, he views him as this criminal fraud and social climber. The next thing that you have to do to make your characters feel real is number 2, choose a signature mannerism. You know how in Mortal Kombat, each character has this like signature finishing move? Yeah, your character needs a signature move too. Hopefully, less violent than the Mortal Kombat ones, but I don't know what genre you're writing, maybe more violent. In Island of the Blue Dolphin by Scott Odell, the father pulls his ear whenever he's angry. In Dark Places by Gillian Flynn, the mother pulls her eyelashes out whenever she's piqued. And in A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter Miller, there's a guy who pulls out a fake eyeball whenever he disagrees with what the other person is saying. In movies, the actor would do the work of coming up with all this. But in books, you have to do the work of the writer and the actor and supply the telling body language. Also, if you're serious about making your book great, I have 250 extra videos about how to write fiction in my Bookfox Academy. So I'll put the link to that in the description. Please check it out. The third thing that you absolutely have to do to make your character feel real is to vary the likability spectrum. And to help us out with examples for this video, we're going to be looking at characters in The Pit, which is an ER show that's new on HBO Max. Now, the first thing you need to do is vary the likability of all the characters in your character pool. You want some characters to be very likable, like Dr. Robbie. Then you want other characters to be pretty unlikable, like Dr. Santos. And then you want some characters to go right in the middle, like Dr. Langdon. If all your characters are extremely unlikable, or if all your characters are extremely likable, both of those can be problems. The second thing you should do for character likability is pull characters back from the edge of the spectrum. So Dr. Santos was almost too unlikable for being a main character. She was constantly picking on the other interns and giving them nasty nicknames, which they didn't really like. And also, she came off as being just wildly overconfident. So the writers had to pull her back from the edge of severe unlikability by just having her apologize for calling people nicknames and sort of like not be so aggressive. On the other side of the spectrum, you have Dr. Robbie, who was like so likable, he was practically a Gary Stu. So what did the writers do for him? Well, they had him make a mistake, in the operating room, and he calls out an order over the top of the person who should be in charge. Immediately, he apologizes, but still, him making a mistake humanizes him. The third thing you should consider is have the likability of your characters change over the arc of the entire story. Dr. Santos has an arc from going from very unlikable to very likable. She does a very kind act at the end of the show to help another doctor with housing. She is extremely sympathetic for a kid who tried to off himself, and she expresses regret for what she did to another doctor. Dr. Robbie's arc, on the other hand, goes from being extremely likable more towards being more human and relatable. He gets angry at several points and loses his temper, and then at another point he actually breaks down. This next point seems like it's too small to matter, but I think it has a huge effect on how a story feels. It's number 4. Don't forget about character micro conflict. So a lot of what we do as writers is we get hyper fixated upon the main conflict of the book, and we're like, let's make sure we get that right. But a lot of the texture of everyday life and a lot of what makes a character into a real character are the little micro conflicts. Let's go old school to It's a Wonderful Life with George Bailey. When he keeps pulling that knob off the stairs and every time gets a little tiny bit angrier, that's a micro conflict. When his daughter catches a cold, it shouldn't be that big of a a deal, but he really resents the teacher for not having her put on her jacket properly. Or even the windows in his old house, which he says makes the house too drafty, enrages him. Sure, the overarching main conflict is that Uncle Billy lost the $8,000 and Potter is going to send him to bankruptcy. But you cannot just have the macro conflict in your fiction. You really need those micro conflicts to push your character over the edge. This next point is my favorite one in the whole video. It is number 5, revealing souls through tiny details. So Joseph Conrad, author of Heart of Darkness, was chilling out in a cafe in Paris, and in walks this guy, and one of his friends asks him, so if you were writing about this guy in your fiction, how would you describe him? And what Conrad said would be that he would describe him by starting with a fleck of dirt on the inner right nostril. Now, obviously we're thinking like, that is such a weird place to start, Conrad. Why start there? But I do think the larger point here is that sometimes very small details can be more telling about a character than the big ones. Why does he have dirt on the inner side of his right nostril? Like, what does that tell us about him as a character? Another example that has honestly lodged itself in my brain for decades and I can't get it out comes from Mark Twain, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And there's a passage where he's describing Huck's father, and he says that the boot that he's wearing is busted and 2 of his toes are sticking out. Now, that's not the only description he gives of the man, but that little detail of this is a guy who doesn't even have proper shoes, whose toes are sticking out of his boots, I feel like that's so telling of who this man is. Or another example would be Bilbo Baggins, coming back from his adventures in The Hobbit, and he has missing buttons. I think those missing buttons really tell you that he's kind of lost something in this journey. He's not coming back the same man. And this makes sense because J.R.R. Tolkien was inspired by all the men coming back from the World War I, who were coming back to their home, but they had definitely changed through the process of war. So make sure when you are describing your character, not just to focus on those big macro details of how tall they are and what they look like, but just like the small details as well that tell you something important about your character. This 6th tip is the opposite of what you would expect when you're building a character, and it is reverse engineer backstory. I feel like the normal way that writers work is they think about a character and think about them chronologically. And so they want to start with saying, all right, what happened to this character back in the day? What was their life like? And they build from there to what the character does in the present moment. Now, that's not a terrible way of doing things, but let me suggest you might want to do it the opposite way around. Try to start with, what does this character do in this present moment story that's unusual in some way? It's just a little bit different than everyone else. Maybe they are always spinning a top. Maybe they are always tying string around something. And once you have that interesting idea, then work backwards from there and come up with, okay, what was this character's backstory that caused them to do that fascinating thing in the present moment? I think doing it this way does 2 things for you. One, it carefully ties your backstory to your present moment story by having cause and effect. They were this way when they were young, therefore they're still doing something in the present that reflects that. And 2, doing it this way helps you make sure that you're coming up with a backstory which is interesting. It's going to surprise you because you're trying to figure out a mystery. Wait a second, why do they do this thing? Let me figure out the answer to that. Okay, and now we are to our very last point, number 7, intentionally one-dimensional. One-dimensional characters are bad, right? Shouldn't do them, shouldn't write them, no, no, no. Well, let me push back on that a little bit. Something that I find is that a lot of writers end up being too democratic with their characters, and they spread the love evenly from their main characters to their minor characters. When really, you should be devoting the lion's share of the page to your main character. And sometimes your side characters, sometimes your more minor characters, they should be more one-dimensional. Because there's a lot lower stakes for these sideboard characters, if you help us to get to know them, they don't need backstory, they don't need very complex motivations, they just need half of the pieces that your main character does, and the reader's gonna buy into them as being real people. Now, the only exception I have to this advice is that sometimes by spreading the love very democratically around all your characters, sometimes you discover that a minor character actually is so amazing, you're like, I should make this person into a much greater character. And so you give them a bigger role. That's the process of discovery, that's fine. But I think in your final book, and we're working on revisions, be okay with minor characters who are more one-dimensional. Don't forget to check the link in the description to sign up for Bookfox Academy, and I hope you have a wonderful writing day.